eastern Upper Galil or crossing the Jordan Valley in the Golan. Okay, you can see a few more right here. And what we're actually into here is the Byzantine or late Roman and Byzantine period synagogues of the Galilee or the northern part of the country. And they have a few interesting things. For example, what is this thing here?
This is the...
It's let's just say it's an animal. It's a winged animal. Okay, that's something we'll need to deal with. What is it doing in the entrance to the synagogue? There are many crowns or different type of crowns. You'll see them also in other objects. It's a decoration, an entrance. You can see the shell. These are very common decorations moving around in the ancient art. And part of them you can see when we move over here. Hey, no animals. Does that mean something? Is that just random? Do they have both? We don't always know. But here you can see there are, let's say they're eagles, which in Hebrew is not nesher. Nesher in Hebrew is vulture, eagle is ait in Hebrew. So that's this. Here you can see flowers, but mainly there's one important thing, and that's this thing. What is this? Or an entrance, or a representation of an entrance to a building, maybe the temple, or it actually might be the ark that's inside the synagogue itself. But these are decorations that are moving around. The best decoration here, the best stone here to show you, is the one that we can get to in the shade, and that's right here.
Or are these replicas or originals?
They are originals.
Wow.
Unless it says differently.
This is the museum. This is where they look for the original.
Wow.
Let's start with the menorah in the middle, and above it there's an inscription. I want you to notice the inscription along it. I want you to notice the inscription in Hebrew is very small. This is the entryway to a synagogue in Naburaya in the Upper Galilee, and there they wrote something very interesting. We'll get back to this today, I hope. And we have a very long inscription with the dedication of who built it and when and so on, and also when, because it's very difficult to read. Always rely upon a sign nearby to remember exactly what you want to read. To the number of, which means according to the number, 494 years to the destruction of the temple. How do I date things? We'll deal with this later again, but they wrote the dating by 494 years of the destruction of the temple. After the destruction of the temple, which means this is from the 5th, 6th century. And here they write the date. But how do they write the date? Not to the creation of the world, but to the destruction of the temple. For centuries after the destruction, that is a very serious way of dating my time. We have more examples, but that's one.
You said you're going to discuss about whether it's 68, 69, or 70?
I didn't say I'm going to discuss that. 70. It's 70.
Because actually in my my app yesterday it said 1955, which would make it 68.
That's true.
Years since the.
But if you take me there, I'll quickly go into it. There is a rabbinic tradition from the Middle Ages that the destruction of the temple, the second temple, took place in 68 and not in 70. How did they get to that calculation? A very, very good question. But there's one thing about it, it can't be correct. For one very simple reason. The Caesar in the days of the destruction was Vespasian. He only became Caesar at the end of 69. So it can't happen.
Do we know which date they
The
were
question
using?
is, did they know this? In the 6th century, the answer is we don't know.
Okay.
Which means to be very accurate fully to the marking date, I can't be sure. We have many more like it. 270 years of destruction and things like that. So we'll say it's
within a range of 2 years.
Between this and that. So there's a plus minus year or two that we can try to date it, but you can't get any better. Let's say the coins discovered in the synagogue won't make it any easier to date it to a specific year, but definitely to the period. But wait a minute, one last thing here. What stone is this made out of?
Limestone.
This is limestone. So we're actually up in the Upper Galilee. This is nearby Tzfat. and that area is a lot of limestone.
And the other stones?
And these are basalt.
Basalt.
Which means this is more eastern. It's eastern, closer to the Jordan Valley Rift, where they also have that type of stone. Very rarely, but it happens, people will import stone. And there you can see the mix.
Aren't there areas where you have both types?
There are a few places where there are both. Not so high up in the Galilee as Naburaya is, but in other places. So that was one. We're going through the underground tunnel for two reasons. One, because it's air conditioned. Two, because there are a few finds also in display.
It's Israel though. So
What you see here is a mosaic floor from Beit She'an from the 6th century, that from a main hall of a very fancy house, and it's in 3 pieces, which means this is just one piece. Let's try to see what we have here. What is it? Does it say? Alexandria. Thanks. We have someone that reads Greek very well. Alexandria, and we have some marine god, maybe something. There are animals, there are plants, there's a boat.
he looks like he's sitting on like
Kentaur.
an animal or
The
something.
kentaur.
You didn't do
I
it.
see, David, you became an Israeli. And he's sitting on some animal, maybe it's a bear. You can see there's a lot of decoration and animals and faces. Wait a minute. In the Ten Commandments, it's very easy because we're reading them in the Torah portion of this tomorrow morning. Ten Commandments, we're told that you're not supposed to have any faces, any animals, any shapes of birds or anything. So we already have one exception outside. So the moment you look at this, you'd say easily, this apparently is not a Jewish home. If we check, Beit She'an of the 6th century of the Byzantine period was actually a mixed area, mostly non-Jewish, but a mixed area. So easily you'd say, fine. And that's what happens to the researchers when they're excavating this mosaic floor. But then they get to the central piece. Mentioning the owner of the house, Leontis Klubas, for making this mosaic with his money for the redemption of his soul and the soul of his brother Jonathan. That's already an interesting inscription. And in the inscription you see,
Menorah.
but look carefully.
Yes.
You can
It's
see
not
it's
original.
installed. You can see it's installed into it.
Yes, installed, yes.
Which means what we have here is the mosaic floor done by an artist. You order an artist, they'll do it, and then you sometimes add what you want to the existing mosaic. Which means sometimes you can, get an idea, tell him what to do, and he does everything. Sometimes you don't. The mosaic floors that were ordered to be done, and they did everything as the person wanted. And sometimes you add whatever you want on your own, and that happens in other locations as well. Which means actually we find out that this Leontis and his brother Jonathan were apparently Jewish. And this is a very, very fancy home with this in the center of its hall, in the central part of the house. We continue to panel number 3.
These are findings from Beit She'an, all?
This is all
All
three
from
Beit
Beit
She'an,
She'an.
from the same house, the same floor.
The same house.
Again, a boat. Again, all sorts of figures. But we could get the idea. They liked rivers. They liked flowing in the river. They liked boats. We're talking about some art. Now, why in Beit She'an could such a thing exist? Well, they're close to the Jordan Valley, not too far from the Kinneret Sea Galilee, so everything mixed in together. But this is actually a moment you can catch the art of a specific period in an area. And many times people copy it. And in an area, everyone copies from their neighbors, and what we get is the basic same thing. In a week and a half, we're going to be in Sipoli, and we're going to see many mosaic floors there. We're going to deal with this a little bit more, but this is something of the local area of Beit She'an. Their neighbors were definitely had this, maybe the same idea, but it doesn't mean their neighbors were also Jewish, as specifically this one. And just notice there's just one little thing that tells us who lives in the house, which means archaeologically speaking, it's very hard to identify the inhabitants of a specific home without having a good inscription or painting that really tells you who lives here, in what style, what religion, what lifestyle they have. Just finishing this.
They were non-religious Jewish.
Ooh, that question we'll need to deal with thoroughly, I'll just say it very quickly. I don't know. Say why I don't know. Because there are many people that might behave, let's say, fulfilling the commandments of the Torah, and at the same time, not fulfilling others. I'll give you the example. I think I said it, and if not, we'll need to say it. Herod was a very interesting guy. In Herod's days, one of the most common things to do was to dip and go into a mikveh, a ritual bath. Which means Herod woke up in the morning, went into a mikveh, just like anyone else in his time and land. But what did he eat or who did he kill 5 minutes later has nothing to do with fulfilling one commandment, unlike what he'll do later on. And I tell you, it's very easy. Here, in his example, they even discovered in his palaces food that I can tell you was not kosher. Easy to identify. But that doesn't mean he doesn't do other things. Which means it's a much more complicated...
Could have been for guests.
What?
Could have been for guests.
What, the wine?
The food.
I'm sure it was only for the guests, I'm sure. And he didn't drink
Because he
with
was
them.
a tzaddik.
He didn't drink. But what am I actually saying is that it's much more complicated than putting things in another.
It's not our kids.
Yes.
Do we know exactly that menorah is of the same period? Or
It was
added-
definitely installed into the existing mosaic. Was it installed in the existing mosaic 5 minutes after it was made,
Or
or
a
one, or
generation.
a generation later? Could be. Could be a
not the
generation.
owner.
Definitely could be that the house was sold to some person, and he added it. But that means he had no problem with all the rest of the mosaic floor, which means for him it was perfectly okay.
There's also some debate about, like, I mean, because, like, we all have pictures and stuff in our house. Like, you know,
Today.
Who doesn't have pictures?
Did your great grandparents have pictures on this? It's something very modern. Something very
It's more
modern.
complicated? No, I mean, to have photos?
Not something from before the 19th century that existed in culture at all, and except the wealthy and the royalty.
But I mean, or even paintings. Like I don't know. Like I've heard that the main issue is like when it's a relief.
Okay.
Like just having a flat picture is not necessary.
Don't
'cause
worry,
you go to-
we'll
you go anywhere
delve a little
and
bit
you
more
see-
into it, and we'll see what we can tell from the archaeological finds. Let's say I skipped the statue, which of course is modern. It isn't ancient, but it also statues have they're three-dimensional, might be more complicated. Depends on the people.
Even in synagogues, you'll have the pictures, paintings of the donors, and you know, like
Okay.
nowadays. It's
Atop an entrance to a building. You can see there's some kind of crownish decoration. Two winged animals. Can you see them, even though obliterated in some way? And underneath an inscription. The inscription is very interesting because I can tell you the artist that made the decoration was not the one that wrote the inscription. How do I know that? If you'll come a little bit closer, you'll hope to see that the inscription starts here, and whoever did it did not plan his space well. You can see it isn't in a straight line. You can see the letters aren't identical, one nice side block, which means what happens is you just add, just like the person that added the menorah on the mosaic floor from Beit Shan. That could be 5 minutes after the artist finished the mosaic, could be 2 generations later, theoretically. Here you can really see someone added it. And what did he write? Baruch atah bevoecha, baruch atah b'tzetecha. May you be blessed when you enter, may you be blessed when you exit. There's an entrance to a synagogue. It's actually an entryway greeting for whoever enters. And apparently they did not think this was not nice and not aesthetic in any way. Because if they would have thought so, they would have, later on, someone would have come, polish it off and write it nicely. It isn't such a huge effort. But apparently for them it was perfectly okay. So here we dip back. We're still in the Byzantine era, but now we're going back in time to the Bronze Age. Of course, there's a lot of prehistoric stuff here that I will skip most of them. I'll go into the Bronze, Iron Age, Second Temple period, and after that will be our focus. And the first thing you need to always deal with is what do you do with the dead? How do you bury your dead? And this is one example. This is a very, very Egyptian way of burial. It was common in southwestern Israel in the area of Dir Balach and the Gaza Strip. This is a very, very common way of burial. It's not that they stood upright, okay? They were mostly lying down, especially because they're discovered lying down. But they're actually big coffins made out of clay that was baked with a face, and this is actually like a window or a door. They can actually enter the body inside, close it, put it away, and that's it. This is very common of the late Bronze Age, and the snakish rope decoration here is very, very Egyptian. So this is a little bit of an evidence of the very high influence that Egypt had on the land of Israel. In the Bronze Age, they actually controlled this place for several centuries straight, and this is something you'll find.
What are these called again?
Anthropoids.
Anthropoids.
In Israel? Everything
If it's in the Israel Museum, it's from Israel with a few exceptions.
So we're like the British Museum?
No, not as much, but there are finds here that actually did not come from archaeological excavations. They came through the antiquities market, especially in the first half of the 20th century, before there was an antiquities law. And that means there are things here that we don't know exactly where they came from.
These were the wealthy, right? These were the...
Usually, if you can afford such a thing, it's the wealthy, and usually the poor people are just buried in the ground. What?
What is it?
Anthropos is human or person. It's similar to a person in its design. That's what it means.
Anthropos. And what is the period exactly?
Late Bronze Age, roughly the 15th and 14th century BCE.
It's Canaanite?
It's Canaan.
But it's not, it look like Egyptian.
It does.
Yeah?
This is a very Egyptian face, very Egyptian face. The chin is very, very Egyptian. Not everyone were pharaohs that had much fancier things, but this is very common.
I mean tradition of the death, tradition of covering.
Oh, no. They did it as well in Egypt.
Yeah?
So I'm going to skip the prehistoric room and go directly to something interesting. Okay, I won't get into the legends of how glass was discovered, even though it's a cool legend. You know, just in a sentence, you light a bonfire on the shore, there's a lot of quartz in the sand, and something comes out in the bottom because it was baked for a long, long time, and they find out that you can use this material, and this is glass. We'll deal with this again in other locations. But glassworking that comes from the shoreline and goes everywhere. Actually, in Jerusalem, for example, Second Temple period, end of Second Temple period, Jewish quarter, they found loads of glass, especially pieces. These are from the Jewish quarter, pieces of glass objects, of all sorts of tubes and all sorts of beads, which means there was apparently glassworking in the city. They come with the raw material, melt it, use it, and do something with it, and get to very, very high quality. But when you want the really highest quality, you need to import it from abroad. And in the Jewish quarter, they found a few very nice objects. For example, these little ones that look like a dried date.
Dried date,
they're
yes.
usually called date bottles. And this is for perfume, for very precious oils that you want to protect and care for. And the most precious object discovered is this one, in bad shape. It was in fire. This was found in one of the wealthy homes of the Jewish quarter, underneath where today the Kotel Yeshiva is, the Herodian quarter that at the moment is still closed because of renovations. And they actually found pieces of this object, managed to assemble it, and managed to find it actually has the imprint of the person that made it on it. And the name is Enyon did this. That's what it says. Enyon did this. And Enyon is a famous glass artist from Sidon, 1st century Common Era. He's known, which means someone in Jerusalem imported a glass jug to, apparently it isn't a very big jug, you can see the reconstruction in full size. If you want to offer your guests some wine, after 3 cups it's over. You need to refill it. But we're actually looking at something very, very precious, very, very wealthy, that tells us that people imported these types of goods from abroad. Now, I don't know if Asher had the time to say this. Not everyone here was in the tour. but one of the main issues in the end of the Second Temple period is purity and impurity laws. So, glass, is it considered impure or not? Can it become impure or not? And the bottom line is, yes, it can. So you need to deal with this also in those days. What do you do? How do you bring it? Can you bring it from abroad? Actually, in some way, purity and impurity laws make you less focus on import from abroad, because then I need to deal with it. If it's locally manufactured, everything is a lot easier. So these are issues that touch also in luxury and of course wealth, and also in halachic religious terms. There's of course a lot more glass. It's very interesting.
Sorry, so none of this was manufactured in Israel at the time?
As I said,
From
those
here
are
on,
bits
right?
and pieces that
From here
definitely
on.
are manufactured in Jerusalem, which
Yeah.
might be an answer to this question I just asked. Which means I get the raw material, I finish making it in my own hands, in my house, in my factory, and then purity-wise it was done by me, and then it's much easier done here. If I import it from who knows where, from modern-day Syria or Turkey, there's a big question here.
So something becomes impure, how do they purify? Just putting it in the mikvah?
Depends what material it's made out of. If it's possible, pottery cannot be purified.
Is it similar to...
Stone cannot become impure.
Because the glass is made from sand,
I
and
do
sand
not.
is stone.
I do not know if there's any chemical logic behind this. Okay. I'll say it like that. Stone is. I'm not sure they even thought of it in such a way. Stone is considered never impure. Why? I don't know, but that's what they say. On the other hand, I'll say pottery is the easiest. The moment it becomes impure, you cannot purify it. Metal can become impure, and you can repurify it by putting it into a mikveh, into a ritual bath. So glass was put on the scale with time. So is wood. Same thing.
Are these related to the totaling laws nowadays?
No.
It's not connected?
Even though they are very similar, they're very similar, it's not the same thing, because that comes a little bit from it, but it basically goes towards kashrut, dietary laws, and not purity and impurity, even though there is a little bit of connection. There is a little bit of connection. Okay, so that's just a moment of the glass hall. There's of course a lot more, but we're really serious. Look at these things. Look at them. They have an issue with the nose. If you look over there at the little incense altars, look at the horns over there, the basalt.
Yes,
the
yes,
stone
yes,
ones, you
yes.
can see the nose. This is actually not Bronze Age yet. This is Chalcolithic period, which means the 4th millennium BCE. And there are many, many finds from those days that tell us a lot about what's going on here. One thing is the Cave of Treasures from Wadi Mishmar in the Judean Desert, and that's the huge display behind you. Lots of objects that are actually made out of copper. Hundreds of things. Most of them you can't even understand what they're used for, or who used them in some way, or whatever, and why were they all put into a cave and totally forgotten. But that's there. From the same period, we also have a few burial customs that we can touch a little bit, and that's these clay boxes. These are ossuaries, but not the ones I'll show you later from the Second Temple period. These are boxes for secondary burial, which means after the body was put for a year or two in a cave or something, they just collect the bones into a box and then just close the box.
That box is enough to hold
The box is enough to hold the bones. The longest bone is this bone. The widest is our hips and our skull. So you can just fit it inside. If you want to calculate the average height of a person, you can give it a good try, because it needs to fit inside, and you can see the different sizes, of course. But that gives you an idea that they believe burial is important, which actually means they believe in this way or that. It's something that we can call an afterlife. If they think burial is important and collecting the bones and putting things together, even though we know nothing about this period. We don't even know what the people spoke, what they taught. And they apparently did not write, because this is before writing was actually invented.
Because that's when history starts.
That's where history starts. There's still a moment before that, and that's the Chalcolithic period, with these very nice finds discovered in several sites in the Golan, in the center of Israel, very similar in their style, in their basic idea, which means they're part of the same culture as well. Unlike other periods, where people living in one region, people living in the other, live in a different culture, and therefore will have different artistic ideas. So the nose from the Golan and the noses from
Nose from Golan.
Oh, sorry, this is Key. This is Megali, but there are also these in the area of Tel Aviv. So it's the same idea. Yeah, we go to I don't know what your house looks like, but mine definitely doesn't look like this. Okay, you see the doorway?
Yeah.
And then the house is actually a one-room open space that you come in from the large part and go into the narrow area. This is a one-apartment house in Arad of the early Bronze Age. They found many of these homes, and because that's the first place where these were identified, it's nicknamed the House from Arad. So when they find two of these in Jerusalem, it's still called the Arad House.
One-room house.
It's a one-room house. And what they usually had outside was an open corbin kitchen outside. But this was the only space where you have the house, which means when it rains outside, you do want to go in for cooking. In Arad, it doesn't rain so much, but in other locations where they use the same style, of course it does. And that means that this style is a very weird construction style. Why should I build only one open space? Did they divide the insides with curtains or who knows what? But basically it's one open space, very primitive in style. What happens next? People will add more rooms to their house and more doorways, and eventually they'll invent the hallway. And what will happen in the hallway? We walk down the hallway of the house and we have several doors and several options. But that actually means that when you enter this house, there's nothing hidden from your eyes unless they have a good thick curtain.
Open floor concept.
Okay. Today, would we like everyone to see what's happening in all our rooms of the house?
No.
No. So that's why we have the more doors and a hallway taking aside, so you only see the public space of the house. So this is a different lifestyle. Can we learn from that more about the people that built this? We can offer a few ideas, but it's very hard to tell without them telling us why they did this. But what I will be able to do is once I have a change in style, it's okay, this is something cultural. They wanted to maybe hide themselves, maybe change how they live.
Okay, so in Arad they just found these. Like they didn't find other styles of houses.
Yes.
I assume. And then so in Jerusalem though you said it was like mixed. So
No, wait a minute. In Jerusalem, from the same period, we have the same style. The
We-
only two residential homes discovered in Jerusalem from that period are the same style.
Okay. So they say,
Later
like,
in Jerusalem, they changed the style.
Maybe they used it as a storeroom, a workshop.
Well, the thing is, you find these in Arad, one next to each other.
Yeah.
So these are all the dwellings of the city. They're all in the best location of the city, not in the corner. They're one next to each other, and you can see that this was the lifestyle. And inside them, of course, they found cooking pots and normal day-to-day objects. Almost everything here is from Arad. We're gonna
Arad, Arad.
in the plan, it's quite far off. Jewelry, oil lamps, tools for grinding, whatever. Could be wheat, could be spices, anything. Which means this is a house, not a storeroom only. This is where people lived. This is where they left their food behind. This is where they did their cooking, and also where they slept. It's all in the same open space. Those that love studio apartments, that enjoy this, no problem. But today it isn't the common thing. In those days it was maybe even the only thing. Stone.
No, don't.
This is Chatzor from the Bronze Age, where there's a big temple.
Chatzor. We've been in Chatzor.
This is a miniature, where everything is larger. You see, you see there are standing stones, right? That are on their narrow part, which actually means someone put them there. It doesn't just fall and stand on the narrow spot. Someone held it, built some base around it. This is the Canaanite temple of Arad, of Chatzor. And what you can see in the middle,
Across from the palace?
it's just across from the palace. You can see what looks like two outstretched arms leading to some semicircle, which actually is or the sun or the moon, depends on how to identify it. Of course, these were ancient gods. So what you see here is the formation of that temple with many of these standing stones, even Matzebot. Standing stone has here Genesis more than once. And this is the way of light living. This is how they worship. Where are they standing? In what direction? This is actually facing west. The temple itself is actually facing west. Actually, both.
The temple face west?
Yeah. Movement is from west to east.
You have worship the sun, is that why?
If it's worshiping the sun, it's actually, it depends if you're looking at the sun rising or the sun setting. But you're definitely on an east-west ironic.
I forgot who it was. One of our guys. When we were in this was the Chatzor, they said that they have the ruin of the not the Talkesh. They have the ruin of the temple, and he was telling us that all the temples face east.
I wouldn't say that all the temples face facing, but it's definitely common. That the temples facing, especially the ones that are connected with the sun and moon. Because then, or they shaman, or in sundown they shaman too. But it's definitely that long. And north-south was much less interesting, especially because they had no compass, they didn't know what north is. And if you continue around here and go to each and every day, of course, this takes us to the culture of the fancy high society of the Bronze Age in the Middle Bronze Age England. And so you take a little bit at their figurines, at their statues, and metal or clay, you can see they have a few things you might identify. For example, all sorts of animals. Part of them are definitely from the world of the cows. Maybe you heard of this once, of a golden calf. Okay, so this is a very normal local culture. And the figurines of seated goddesses and gods, many times they're seated. And even if you can look at part of them, they even have a little addition that makes them, you can actually put them on a chair, especially the one here on the right, has a little spot on the bottom where you can really fit it into maybe a clay or wooden little seat. So these are the ways the gods and goddesses are actually depicted in those days. And that means that they look at something in nature, in the skies, and somewhere, and copy them. If it's the animals, if it's even human beings. But very, very common is this seated god or goddess inhabited in the Philistine world centuries later. It's very, very common, and it also has its origins in the prehistoric period. Also like a little statue that's seated on a chair. So this is a little bit here of what you can see, and I'm going to just take you to, I think if I remember correctly, this is from Timnah. This is Lachish. No, it isn't from Timnah, even though there's one like it in Timnah. But what you can see here is a model, or a mold that you can make a clay figurine from. So you can see it's actually engraved, and then you put the clay inside, press it in, let it dry. You take it out. You can do this with wax, of course, and then you can get, and then you can actually even make it out of metal using the wax as a model. These are also ways of making mass production of gods. Remember, this is the pocket version. This is what you take with you when you go on your journeys. This is what you walk around. What? But in a niche, you could use a larger one as well. But definitely, this is something portable. It's on purpose, something you can move around. It's not something that's only in the temple in the city. It can be actually taken wherever you go.
Portable.
Yes.